So welcome to Tuesday. Welcome to Storytime. I've been thinking a lot about what I wanted to share today, and I wish I could say that I figured something out. The truth is, I'm still in process, coming to digest what is the story on my own relationship with courage, particularly with the courage to do hard things. I shared last week about some of the hard things that I did as a child that challenged, that felt like they were the edge of safety. But there's another edge. There's another place of practicing courage that is beyond my own will, my own fire of can I do hard things? And that edge is actually in relationships. In other words, what I mean is as soon as there becomes another person involved in either the consequences of my decision, my action, my will to do, or there's connection in the sense that we make a decision together. So they may suffer from the consequences, or they may have an equal say in the decision making. And it's in these relationships that I find it to be the greatest challenge. Let me back up for a minute, because in some ways that challenge, or challenge and support as the nature goes, in terms of when we reach our edge and we want to grow through that edge, that's where challenge and support in equal parts helps facilitate that forward growth. So last week I talked a little bit about the three kinds of movement in terms of the intention to our yoga practice. And that is transportation, right? So I'm moving my body, I'm transporting my limbs, or transporting my whole body, right? This is a bit of a cooperation, in which case my mind and my body are cooperating, my balance is shifting, maybe even my right side and my left side. So there's a cooperation. And I really, really, really love the idea and the practice of cooperation. Even as a gamer, as a board gamer, my family likes to play board games. I prefer the cooperation games versus those that are rooted in competition, and specifically those, I don't like those that endorse and require lying, bluffing, or cheating. Not my thing. I would rather not play a game that asks me to lie, to bluff, to cheat, to undermine my play partners. I'd rather do a cooperative game. Now, the second nature of movement was transformation. And for me, this is really about the mental energy, in the sense that moving from competition towards collaboration. Now, one of my early thesis ideas for my doctoral dissertation was on this notion of collaboration and cooperation. And in the preemptive research, what I learned was that evolutionarily speaking, humans decided and evolved these two concepts simultaneously, but they were dependent on each other. In other words, to compete and to collaborate, right? Meant whether or not you were my friend or my foe. So in that way, we can transform our relationship by shifting from a competition to a collaboration. And sometimes collaboration is, in fact, cooperation. But the third dimension of movement that I talked about is really more about what happens on the energetic level. This is the translation, or the communication. In other words, am I clearly communicating what I want in order to elicit collaboration and cooperation? Or is there some kind of defensive, protective, even nonverbal part of the way in which I'm living that, excuse me, that invokes more of that competition or that protection, that defensiveness? And really where I'm seeing this most tested in my life presently. And again, like I said, this story is actually unfolding. So check in with me after the holidays, because the boundary is the practice of knowing what matters most and then holding that so that someone else doesn't have access to violate that boundary. Now, that's not perfect, right? We can't control everything. If someone wants to violate our boundaries, chances are they're going to violate our boundaries. But what's most difficult for me is actually renegotiating that boundary as I get clearer on what that boundary means. So I've talked about self-care as my priority. And that goes hand in hand with the practice of loving and supporting and caring for my family. So what happens when these values compete? What happens internally? It's my job, right? This is where my responsibility, where my wisdom has to show up, ideally with a bit of courage, with just enough courage to say, I feel dissonance here. So let me give you the little example I shared. Self-care means I'm getting adequate sleep. I'm eating well. I'm doing my practice. I'm doing what's mine to do and letting others do what is theirs to do. And as a parent, this is really, really hard. And a parent of young adults coming into their own, even more so. So the invitation to my time and energy was to drive my eldest child to a job, right? In which case that meant we both had to get up earlier because this was an earlier part of our day. And when I suggested that my child transport themselves, I gave some boundaries, right? I said, I think you could ride your bicycle to this job with the caveat of temperature, right? Because I don't want to ride my bicycle and be frozen. My two caveats that I suggested to my child were to check on whether there was a safe place to store her bike at the job. And secondly, the temperature, meaning the temperature of the air. If it was below, I think I told her if it was below 40, maybe even 42, that I didn't want her to ride her bicycle in this temperature. Anyway, I don't know what the temperature is today, but it feels cold, but not that cold. But it's the second day of me driving her to this job, which I'm super excited about her having, but confused about my boundary and where it is that I enable her to not take ownership. And if it wasn't for this context, right, that when I picked her up yesterday, we were already out. I have a few more minutes in my day that aren't accounted for. So I offered to help her with some other errands that need to be done, only to learn that she hasn't done the prep work to ensure that those errands can be done. Stopping by the pharmacy, stopping by her school, doing a couple of things that are more tasky, busy, and needed to be driven around for. So when I got home, I connected with my partner and I downloaded my frustration. I was sad, I was angry, I was disappointed, but mostly I felt taken advantage of. Like, why can't you do your part? And then I realized, and I'm still unfolding this, how much I had invested into helping her rather than letting her suffer the natural consequences of her not doing these preparatory tasks. Therefore, we can't do the completion tasks. And this is where Peter came in. This is where my husband helped me. He's like, well, you know, consequences will happen. We cannot protect her from those consequences. And really, there are no consequences for me in this scenario, aside from needing to go to bed earlier so that I can get up and not be bitter when I take her to the job tomorrow. So what does this mean? Well, to wrap up story time, what I want to remind all of us, and maybe this is a reminder for my future self as well, is that negotiating these boundaries are not only an internal conversation, peeling back the layers to find what I really, really want, what I want in me, and then to make that, to observe and comment in relationship, which is going to require communication. Because if I want that boundary, if I want that line to move, it's going to require cooperation, the body stuff. How invested am I in physically? It's going to require collaboration, some mind, some creativity, some bringing together what are our objectives and goals. And fundamentally, this hardest part of this showing up to be brave is to be vulnerable and saying, I know I said I would do this, but something's shifted, something's changed. And owning that, knowing that the consequences are also about me accepting responsibility for what was later discovered to be out of my alignment. That courage to communicate what I am learning in process before I even necessarily know what I want, just recognizing not this, net thee, net thee. I want you to have this job. I want you to have my love and my support. I want you to know how to move through the world. But I also want you to accept your own responsibility, which ironically was brought back for me to own my own responsibility and how I enable those around me to push the boundary. One last little caveat here. In light of COVID, when we are looking for an external deciding factor, in other words, a test tells me I'm positive, rather than listening to my inner boundary that says, I'm having a little bit of something, or maybe someone I was exposed to, or maybe I wasn't using all of the protocols because I'm tired of them. In other words, did I increase my risk and expect to still have access to the things that I want to have access to? Can you see how this kind of boundary ebb and flow is part of our problem, part of our inability to get beyond this particular edge? In other words, I'm really grateful that a couple of students who have questionable exposure have opted to stay away from the studio for real time. They're participating virtually. But what that means is that they're not waiting for a positive test. They're not waiting for some outside influence to tell them you have to quarantine. They're making a decision based on a reassessment, a continual reassessment of their risks and their potential risks. One of them is opting to stay home because she wants to spend time with her grandbaby and doesn't want to bring any additional risk into that exposure. The other one I'm thinking of had a potential risk of exposure, and so preemptively doesn't yet have results, is saying, nope, I don't need to expose anybody else, particularly those in my community who are at risk or have extenuating circumstances. So in conclusion of these kind of hodgepodge of stories, the courage to do hard things for me is recognizing my boundaries, and particularly when I have enabled others to make that boundary less definitive. I have been either overcompensating, overgiving, over-supporting, enabling, or under-protecting, not doing my self-care, not shifting my priorities in order to accommodate what I've offered to do. So let's begin again. How about that, right? Breathe. Check in and notice where there might be some dissonance in your body, in your mind, in your breath. And then maybe it is a matter of checking in. How am I cooperating? How am I collaborating? How am I communicating so that I can move in the direction of my best living so I can grow and transform? I'm sure that this in itself will continue to unfold for me. But maybe there's something about it that is already awakening something in you to help you move in a more mindful and intentional way through these days of celebration and joy, through these shortening sunlight. Tonight is the solstice, so we move towards light, meaning our days are literally a minute longer of sunlight from now until the peak in the summer. How do you want to spend that extra minute of light or that extra minute of love for yourself and for each other? For me, I want to collaborate. I want to cooperate, and I want to communicate clearly from a place of love, rooted in truth and compassion. I'll see you next year for the reopening of Storytime. And until then, may you be well. May you breathe deeply and move freely, labor lovingly, and live vibrantly. May you be well. Namaste.